What's going on? What's going on is you're fixing to ride the lightning, son. Those words were spoken on a cold December night in Windsor, Virginia. Not in a dark alley, not in the middle of a crime. They were spoken to a man sitting in his car. Engine off, hands visible, not running, not threatening anyone, not committing any crime. A man who at that very moment was wearing the uniform of the United States Army. The officer who said those words, who told an American soldier he was fixing to ride the lightning, had no idea 3 cameras were rolling. He had no idea that every single word coming out of his mouth was being preserved forever. He had no idea that within weeks his name would be known across the entire country and that his career in law enforcement would be finished before the year was out. This is not a story someone made up. This is not a dramatization loosely based on events. Every word you are about to hear comes directly from body camera, footage, federal court documents, and verified journalism. The lawsuit is public record. The recording is real. The damage, to one man's body, to one soldier's dignity, and to the department that let it happen, is documented, verified, and permanent. Welcome to True Justice Stories, and on this channel we cover the cases that actually happened. Before we go any further, if you believe a man in a United States Army uniform should be able to sit in his own car without a gun pointed at his face, hit subscribe, and stay with me, because this story is about to get a lot more complicated before it gets resolved. This is the story of Lieutenant Caron Nazario, the night his life changed forever, and the reckoning that followed. To understand what happened on December 5th, 2020, you have to understand who Caron Nazario was, and what that night meant in the context of not just his life, but the country he had chosen to serve. Caron Nazario was 27 years old at the time of the incident. He was a second lieutenant in the United States Army, assigned to the Medical Corps, the branch responsible for keeping soldiers alive in the field, for providing care under conditions most people can't imagine, for running toward danger when everyone else is running away. He had worked hard to get there. He had studied. He had trained. He had earned his commission. And on December 5th, 2020, he was driving home from work in Windsor, Virginia, wearing his uniform, as he often did. He had recently purchased a new vehicle, a Chevy Tahoe. It was brand new, and like many new vehicles sold in Virginia, it had a temporary paper license plate affixed to the rear window while the permanent plates were being processed. This is a completely standard, completely legal practice. Millions of cars on American roads at any given moment have temporary paper plates. There is nothing unusual about it. There is nothing suspicious about it. It is simply how car purchases work. None of them that mattered to the 2 officers who pulled in behind him that night. Officers Joe Gutierrez and Daniel Crocker were both patrol officers with the Windsor Police Department, a small department in a small town. Windsor, Virginia has a population of just over 2,700 people. It is not a high-crime area. It is not a city where officers are regularly dealing with violent offenders or dangerous situations. It is, by almost every measure, a quiet town. The kind of place where a traffic stop on most nights ends with a warning and a reminder to get that registration renewed. This was not most nights. Officers Gutierrez and Crocker claimed they could not see the temporary license plate. They activated their lights behind Nazario's Tahoe on Route 460, and what happened next is where everything began. Nazario saw the lights. He acknowledged them. His hazard lights came on, indicating he was aware of the police presence behind him. And then he did something that millions of Black Americans understand at a visceral, instinctive level. He did not stop on the dark, isolated roadside. He kept driving, slowly, carefully, less than a mile, to a well-lit BP gas station where there were lights, where there were potential witnesses, where there were cameras, where, if something went wrong, someone would see it. This is not a criminal act. This is not evasion. The legal standard for a traffic stop requires that a driver pull over in a reasonably safe location in a reasonable amount of time. Nazario did exactly that. Law enforcement agencies themselves have issued guidance telling people, particularly people of color, that it is reasonable and legal to drive to a well-lit, populated location before stopping, especially at night. He was not fleeing. He was being careful. He was trying to survive. He had no idea that the officers behind him had already made up their minds about who he was. What we know from later testimony is that Officer Gutierrez, watching Nazario's Tahoe move slowly toward the gas station with its hazards on, told his partner he was certain the driver was not white. That observation, that assumption, was not based on anything Nazario had done. It was based on a glance, a split-second judgment, and it colored everything that followed. By the time Caron Nazario pulled into that BP gas station and brought his car to a stop, the interaction had already been decided. Not by law, not by evidence, not by anything Nazario had done. It had been decided by two officers who had already determined what kind of person they were dealing with before they even saw his face. Both officers exited their vehicles with their hands on their weapons. As Nazario's Tahoe sat under the bright gas station lights, Gutierrez and Crocker approached from both sides. They did not approach calmly. They did not approach as officers coming to address a minor traffic violation. They came with weapons drawn. Nazario sat in the driver's seat with his hands visible, raised near the window. He was in full army uniform. The uniform was clearly visible, and he sat there, hands up, watching two men with guns approach his car, and he made a decision that would define the entire interaction. He would stay calm. He would keep his hands visible. He would not give them any reason to pull that trigger. He spoke first. "I'm honestly afraid to get out of the car." It was not a threat. It was not defiance. It was the truth, spoken plainly by a man in a United States Army uniform who knew, because this country had given him every reason to know, that the next few seconds could go very, very wrong. Officer Gutierrez's response was immediate. "Yeah, you should be." Read that again. A man in an army uniform, hands raised, has just told an officer he is afraid. And the officer's response, captured on body camera, preserved in federal court records, is to confirm that he should be afraid. Not to reassure him, not to de-escalate, to confirm the fear, to lean into it, to use it. What followed was chaos that no one in that gas station that night could have anticipated. Both officers began issuing commands simultaneously, not sequentially, not clearly, but at the same time from both sides of the vehicle, contradicting each other. "Get out of the car, keep your hands up, open the door, don't move." The commands were impossible to follow simultaneously, and they were being shouted at a man who was already telling them he was afraid, whose hands were already visible, who had done nothing, to justify the level of force being deployed against him. Nazario tried to comply. He tried to respond to the commands. He kept his hands visible. He tried to speak. He asked calmly what was happening. What had he done? Why were there guns pointed at his face? The officers did not answer those questions. The officers escalated. Gutierrez reached for his pepper spray. Lieutenant Caron Nazario, a commissioned officer in the United States Army Medical Corps, sitting in his car with his hands raised in full military uniform under the bright lights of a gas station with multiple cameras rolling, was pepper sprayed. Once, then again, then a third time, then a fourth. 4 separate applications of pepper spray to a man whose hands had been raised the entire time. A man who had done nothing to warrant the stop in the first place. A man who had specifically driven to a well-lit location to protect himself. A man who had told the officers he was afraid, and had been told by one of them that he should be. After the pepper spray, Nazario was pulled from the vehicle. He was placed on the ground. He was handcuffed. He was detained. And here's one of the most important facts in this entire case. Lieutenant Caron Nazario was never charged with a single crime. Not that night, not ever. No charges were filed. No ticket was issued for the alleged missing license plate. The same plate that was, in fact, visible in the rear window of the Tahoe the entire time. He was pepper sprayed, detained, and released. And then Officer Gutierrez did something that, when it came to light, added an entirely new dimension to what had already happened. Gutierrez told Nazario he was going to give him a chance to make this go away. He told him that if Nazario agreed not to file a complaint, if he kept quiet about what had just happened, Gutierrez would make sure nothing went on his record. He suggested that Nazario's military career could be damaged if this became official. He was, according to the lawsuit and the recording, attempting to pressure a victim of excessive force into silence. It didn't work. What Officer Joe Gutierrez did not know, what neither Gutierrez nor Crocker had apparently considered, was that the entire encounter had been captured on not 1, not 2, but 3 separate cameras. Both officers were wearing body cameras. Those cameras were rolling from the moment they exited. Their vehicles, capturing every command, every escalation, every application of pepper spray, every word spoken, including the words about making things go away. And Lieutenant Nazario, because he understood the world he was moving through and the risks that came with it, had his own camera recording inside his vehicle. 3 cameras, all rolling, every second, every word, every moment. Nazario retained an attorney, Jonathan Arthur, and filed a federal lawsuit in the Eastern District of Virginia in April 2021. The lawsuit named Officer Joe Gutierrez, Officer Daniel Crocker, and the town of Windsor as defendants. It alleged violation of Nazario's civil rights under the First and Fourth Amendments, unlawful detention, excessive use of force, and retaliation. The filing of that lawsuit triggered the release of the body camera footage, and when that footage went public, it did not trickle out quietly. It exploded. Within days, the video had been viewed millions of times. News. Organizations across the country picked it up. CNN obtained the footage directly. The Associated Press ran the story. Every major network covered it, and the public reaction was immediate, visceral, and sustained. People watched a man in a United States Army uniform, hands raised, being pepper sprayed 4 times, and they could not look away. Not because it was shocking in the abstract, because in a country that had spent the preceding year grappling with the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others, it was not abstract at all. It was specific. It was documented. It was right there on screen, in high definition with audio, from multiple angles. The Sergeant Major of the Army, the most senior enlisted soldier in the entire United States Army, publicly addressed the incident. The Army itself made clear that what had happened to one of its officers was unacceptable. Military officials expressed outrage. Veterans groups expressed outrage. Civil rights organizations expressed outrage. And within days of the footage going public, the Windsor Police Department announced that Officer Joe Gutierrez had been terminated. Gutierrez was fired. His career in law enforcement was over. The department said his actions were not consistent with their training or their values. They said the stop had been handled improperly. They acknowledged in the clearest possible terms that what had happened to Caron Nazario should not have happened. Officer Daniel Crocker, who had also been present at the stop and had also drawn his weapon, was reprimanded but not fired. He remained on the force. The Windsor Police Department conducted an internal review. The town of Windsor hired outside legal counsel, and in Richmond at the state level, Attorney General Mark Herring announced that his office would investigate the Windsor Police Department's broader practices. Not just this incident, but the patterns, the culture, the training, the policies that had produced 2 officers who thought this was an acceptable way to treat anyone, let alone a uniformed member of the United States military. This was no longer just about one traffic stop. It was about everything that traffic stop revealed. Here is where this story diverges sharply from the kind of neat, resolved narratives you see on channels that deal in fiction. Because what happened next in the legal system was not clean. It was not satisfying. It was not the kind of outcome that lets you walk away feeling like justice was served. And that is precisely why it matters. The federal lawsuit filed by Caron Nazario made its way through the court system. Gutierrez, now terminated and no longer shielded by active employment, contested the claims against him personally. The town attempted to distance itself from Gutierrez's individual conduct. There were motions, hearings, rulings on qualified immunity. The legal doctrine that shields government officials from civil liability unless their conduct violates clearly established law. Let's talk about qualified immunity for a moment, because it is central to why civil rights lawsuits so often fail to produce the outcomes the public expects. Qualified immunity does not mean an officer has to be innocent. It means that even if they violated someone's rights, they cannot be held personally liable unless a court has previously ruled that the specific behavior, the exact scenario, was unconstitutional. It is a doctrine created by the Supreme Court that has been criticized by legal scholars across the ideological spectrum as creating near-total immunity for officers who abuse their power. Under qualified immunity, an officer can do something that any reasonable person would recognize as a civil rights violation and still walk away without paying $1 in damages, as long as no prior case addressed that exact scenario. In the Nazario case, the federal court ruled that Gutierrez was not protected by qualified immunity for some of the claims, meaning the case could proceed, and Gutierrez could be held personally liable. That ruling was itself significant. Courts granting that level of personal exposure to a former officer is not something that happens routinely, but then came the jury. After all of it, the footage, the fired officer, the national coverage, the Army's response, the Attorney General's investigation, the federal lawsuit. After all of that, the jury in the civil trial awarded Caron Nazario damages of $3,685. $3,685. Not $950,000. Not $1 million. Not the kind of number that sends a message to departments across the country. $3,685 for being pepper sprayed 4 times in full military uniform, for being handcuffed and detained without cause, for being told he should be afraid, for having an officer attempt to pressure him into silence afterward, for a federal civil rights violation caught on 3 cameras from multiple angles. $3,685. The reaction was instant and fierce. Civil rights attorneys called it an insult. Legal commentators called it a demonstration of how difficult it is to hold individual officers financially accountable even when the evidence is overwhelming. Advocates pointed to it as proof that the civil court system, on its own, is not equipped to deliver the kind of justice that deters future misconduct. Nazario's legal team filed an appeal. The case continued, and separately, the systemic investigation by the Attorney General's office into Windsor's broader practices moved forward on its own track, independent of the civil damages question. Because here is what the $3,685 verdict missed. What any single civil case, no matter how it resolves, always risks missing. The individual outcome is only part of the story. The bigger question is what the system does with what it learned. And in that regard, the Nazario case produced consequences that a dollar amount can't fully capture. Officer Joe Gutierrez was fired within days of the footage going public. That is a fact. His career in law enforcement is over. The man who told a uniformed Army lieutenant he should be afraid, who pepper sprayed him 4 times with his hands raised, who then suggested he could make the complaint disappear. That man no longer has a badge. Whatever else happens, that is a consequence that is real and permanent. The Windsor Police Department underwent an external review that examined its training, its use of force policies, its oversight mechanisms, and its history of stops and complaints. That review, demanded by the Attorney General's office, produced recommendations that the department was required to address. Small departments in Virginia were put on notice that the state was watching, that body camera footage would be scrutinized, and that the kind of conduct captured in Windsor would not be treated as a local matter to be resolved quietly. The case accelerated conversations in Virginia's legislature about police reform. Virginia had already passed significant reform legislation in 2020, limiting qualified immunity for state-level claims, banning certain uses of force, expanding transparency requirements. The Nazario case gave those conversations renewed urgency and specific, undeniable evidence of why the reforms were necessary. For Caron Nazario personally, the aftermath has been a complicated mix of vindication and ongoing struggle. He continued his service in the Army. He did not go quietly. He pursued the lawsuit through the courts, including the appeal after the $3,685 verdict. He became, whether he sought it or not, a public figure whose name is now part of the permanent record of this country's ongoing reckoning with race, policing, and the gap between the rights that are promised and the rights that are delivered. He sat in his car with his hands raised in uniform and told an eighth officer he was afraid. He was told he should be. He kept his hands up anyway. He pressed record. He called a lawyer. He went to federal court. He did everything you are supposed to do, and the system gave him $3,000 and change. That is not a story about failure. It is a story about the distance, the vast, documented, filmed from 3 angles distance between what this country says it stands for and what it actually does when a black man in a uniform sits in a well-lit gas station with his hands raised. To understand how December 5th, 2020 happened, it helps to understand not just what Gutierrez did in the moment, but what the record shows about who he was before that night and what the department's culture had permitted. Joe Gutierrez was not a rookie. He was an experienced patrol officer who had been with the Windsor Police Department long enough to know the protocols, to know the law, and to know where the lines were. What the record shows is that he crossed those lines deliberately, confidently, and without apparent concern that anyone was watching. When Gutierrez said in recorded testimony that he was certain the driver of the Tahoe was not white based on how the driver was behaving, driving slowly, hazards on, heading to a lit location, he was not describing probable cause. He was describing a profile. He was describing the exact cognitive process that turns a temporary license plate into a reason to approach with a weapon drawn. The behavior Nazario exhibited was the behavior recommended by safety experts, by lawyers, by advocates, by common sense, and Gutierrez had interpreted it as criminal. The suggestion that Nazario could make the whole thing disappear by staying quiet is, in many ways, the most revealing moment of the entire encounter. It tells us that Gutierrez understood, at some level, that what he had done was wrong. You do not offer to make something go away unless you know it needs to go away. You do not suggest someone's military career could be damaged by filing a complaint unless you are trying to weaponize fear. It was not the behavior of an officer who believed he had acted correctly. It was the behavior of an officer who was trying to avoid accountability. And for a moment, a brief, terrible moment, it might have worked. Nazario was pepper sprayed, detained, shaken. He had just been told by a police officer that his Army career could be at risk if he spoke up. He was alone at a gas station in a small Virginia town in the middle of the night, in a country where black men who encounter police do not always survive the encounter. He pressed charges anyway. He called Jonathan Arthur anyway. He filed the lawsuit anyway. and the 3 cameras that were rolling delivered the evidence that made silence impossible. It is worth pausing to remember when this happened. December 2020. The country had spent the year watching George Floyd die under a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It had watched Breonna Taylor be killed in her own home. It had watched the footage of Ahmaud Arbery being hunted down while jogging. It had watched over and over the specific, particular horror of Black Americans being killed or brutalized by people who were supposed to protect them. And it had watched the systems designed to hold those people accountable fail to do so, repeatedly, predictably, with documented consistency. Into that context came the footage from Windsor, Virginia. And what made it different, what made it something people could not look away from, was not just the outrage of it. It was the specificity. It was the uniform. It was the hands raised. It was the calm voice saying, "I am afraid," and the response confirming that he should be. It was the impossibility of the usual defenses, because the defenses that get deployed after these incidents. He was reaching. He was resisting. We couldn't see his hands. The officer feared for his life. We don't know what happened before the camera started rolling. None of them worked here. The camera started rolling from the very beginning. The hands were visible the entire time. The uniform was visible the entire time. The only danger in that gas station on December 5th, 2020, was the danger that 2 officers brought with them when they approached with their weapons drawn. The Sergeant Major of the Army, the most senior enlisted soldier in the United States military, publicly expressed that the incident was unacceptable. Think about what it means for the Army to have to publicly defend one of its own officers against the police force of a small Virginia town. Think about what it means that a man who serves the country, who wears its uniform, who has dedicated his career to its protection, cannot sit in a car at a gas station without a weapon pointed at his face. That is not a policing problem in isolation. It is a reflection of something deeper, a presumption, embedded in practice and culture and the split-second decisions made on dark roads at night, that some bodies are dangerous by default, that some skin tones are probable cause, that some people have to prove over and over in every encounter, with every interaction, that they have the right to exist in the spaces they are in. Lieutenant Caron Nazario had the most literal possible proof of belonging that a country can issue: a military commission, a uniform, a sworn oath, and it was not enough. Let's talk about $3,685, because I think it's important to sit with that number and understand what it means, rather than just being outraged by it and moving on. Civil damages in cases like this serve multiple purposes. They are supposed to compensate the victim for what they suffered. They are supposed to send a message to the institution and to others that this conduct is costly. They are supposed to function as a deterrent. $3,000 does none of those things. $3,000 is less than the cost of a decent used car. It is not justice. It is barely an acknowledgement. But here's the harder question. Why did the jury arrive there? Juries in civil rights cases face a set of legal instructions that can make it genuinely difficult to award large damages even when the conduct was clearly wrong. They have to assign specific dollar values to specific harms. They have to work within frameworks that were designed in ways that systematically undervalue the harms experienced by people whose rights have been violated. The doctrine of qualified immunity, even when it does not bar a case entirely, shapes the way jurors think about officer conduct. The word reasonable gets deployed in ways that give enormous benefit of the doubt to officers and almost none to the people they stopped. And we have to be honest, jury composition matters. Who is in the room when these decisions get made is not a neutral question. None of this is to say the verdict was legally required. It was not. It was a choice made by 12 people who had seen the footage, who had heard the testimony, who knew what happened at that gas station, and who decided that what it was worth in dollars and cents was $3,685. Caron Nazario appealed. As of the filing of this script, that process continues. The systemic investigation continues. The reform conversations continue. But the verdict is a reminder, a cold, uncomfortable, necessary reminder, that evidence is not the same as accountability. That footage does not guarantee justice. That a uniform is not a shield against the presumptions that determine whether you get home safely. The system did not fail because no one was watching. The system failed while everyone was watching. And that is perhaps the most important thing this case has to teach us. Joe Gutierrez was fired. That is a real consequence, and it matters. But what about the culture that produced him? What about the training that did not prevent what happened? What about the supervisor who presumably had some visibility into how Gutierrez operated, how he made decisions, How he used the authority of the badge. The Windsor Police Department is a small department. It does not have the resources of a major urban force. It does not have the same oversight infrastructure. And that, in many ways, is exactly the problem. Small departments across the country operate with minimal oversight, minimal accountability, and minimal consequences for a culture that permits, or produces, officers who approach traffic stops with their weapons drawn over a temporary license plate. Virginia's reforms, accelerated by the Nazario case and others like it, moved in the right direction. The state limited qualified immunity for state-level civil rights claims, meaning that in Virginia, officers can be held personally liable for civil rights violations even when no prior court ruling established that their exact conduct was illegal. That is a meaningful change. It removes one of the most powerful shields that had protected officers from the financial consequences of misconduct. The state also expanded body camera requirements, increased transparency in use of force reporting, and strengthened civilian oversight mechanisms. These are not small things. They are the result of sustained, documented pressure, the kind that comes when cases like this one are not just seen but remembered, not just watched but understood. But, and this is the part that requires honesty, none of these reforms eliminate the underlying problem. They create systems that are better equipped to identify and respond to misconduct. They do not eliminate the presumptions that cause it in the first place. The presumption that a man in a new vehicle driving slowly to a lit location is suspicious. The presumption that knowing a driver is, quote, not white is relevant information for a traffic stop. The presumption that fear expressed by a detainee is something to be confirmed rather than addressed. Those presumptions are not written in any policy manual. They are not in any training curriculum. They live somewhere harder to reach. In the accumulated decisions, habits, instincts, and cultures of departments and officers and a society that has, for a very long time, encoded certain bodies as dangerous by default. Fixing that requires more than a training module. It requires more than an external review. It requires a sustained, uncomfortable collective willingness to look at the evidence, the footage, the verdicts, the patterns, and take seriously what it shows. There is something that gets lost sometimes in the legal analysis and the systemic critique, and it is the most human part of this story. Caron Nazario made a choice, several of them. He chose to drive to a lit location, not because he was trying to evade, because he was trying to survive. Because he understood, with the clarity that comes from living in a particular body in a particular country, that dark roads and drawn weapons are a dangerous combination, and that the danger does not fall equally. He chose to keep his hands raised, even when the commands were contradictory, even when the pepper spray came, even when he was being pulled from the car. His hands stayed visible because he knew that the moment they didn't, the story could change in ways no camera could fix. He chose to speak clearly and calmly, to say he was afraid, to ask what was happening, to not give them anything that could be used to justify what was already being done to him. And after all of it, after the pepper spray and the handcuffs and the suggestion that he could make it all disappear by staying quiet, he chose to press record on what he had witnessed. He chose to call a lawyer. He chose to go to federal court and stand in front of a jury and tell the truth about what happened at that gas station. $3,685. He appealed anyway. There is a kind of courage in that which does not show up in any verdict. The courage to say, what happened to me was wrong, and I am going to make it part of the record, even if the record does not give me what I deserve. The courage to be the person whose name gets attached to a case that will be cited in training programs and law review articles and congressional testimony for years to come. The courage to be visible permanently, as the man who was pepper sprayed in uniform with his hands raised, and who refused to let that be the end of the story. Caron Nazario continued his service in the United States Army after December 5, 2020. He continued to wear that uniform. He continued to serve the country that had not, in that gas station in Windsor, Virginia, served him. Make of that what you will. Officer Joe Gutierrez told Caron Nazario he was fixing to ride the lightning. He said that to a uniformed Army officer who was sitting calmly in his car with his hands raised. He said it on camera. He said it on 3 cameras. And within weeks, his career was over. His name was known across the country, and the footage of what he had done was being played in living rooms and courtrooms and newsrooms from Virginia to California. He was the one who rode the lightning. But I want to be careful not to let the story end there, because ending it there, with the satisfying image of the bad officer losing his badge, lets us off the hook too easily. It lets us believe that the problem was Gutierrez, that the problem was one man, one night, one set of terrible decisions, and the evidence does not support that belief. The problem is a system that produces officers who approach a new car with its hazards on and its driver in full military uniform as a threat. The problem is a legal doctrine that makes it almost impossible to hold officers financially accountable even when the evidence is overwhelming. The problem is a jury system that looked at 3 cameras worth of footage and arrived at $3,685. The problem is a country that has been watching this footage, this specific kind of footage, of black men being stopped and searched and detained and killed for years and has not yet found a way to make it stop. The problem is the distance between what we say we are and what the evidence shows we are. And the evidence in this case is very clear. It was captured on 3 cameras. It was filed in federal court. It is public record. It is not going away. Before you go, what city or country are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. We always want to know where our community is coming from. And if you believe that a man in a United States Army uniform should be able to sit in his car with his hands raised without a weapon pointed at his face, like this video and subscribe. Because we are not done covering the cases that actually happened. We are not done until accountability is the standard, not the exception. The name is Lieutenant Caron Nazario. Remember it, because the country should not be allowed to forget it.